Okay, so let's talk briefly about something you're probably familiar with. Well, actually, if you're watching this video, you're definitely familiar with it, and that's going to be our screens. And in particular, how do we control this with the computer? You might be somewhat familiar with it. Basically, if not, what we have is a great big grid of pixels. And we have different devices to get the pixels. So, I like to put little circuits together for examples. LEDs are handy with that, easy with that, and I have lots of LEDs. So we'll be talking about LEDs, but there are other ways other types of pixels out there. We'll talk about light emitting diodes, but however we want to do these. And the general idea is, we'll make a bunch of pixels blue, some other pixels yellow, some green ones over here, and then they go together to form a picture. We'll get to the colors in a few minutes. Let's start off with just kind of a black and white one. Just turning the pixel on and turning the pixel off. And it's a big grid, so it probably already kind of makes sense what we need to do. We don't want to run a control to every single one of those. For example, my laptop that I'm using to put this video together has a 1366 by 768 screen, which means 1366 times 768. There are 1,049,088 pixels on the screen of my laptop. It's quite a few. Computer has no trouble flipping a million switches, just turning a million pixels on and off. But we're going to refresh this screen a lot of times, right? So a million there, so that's up in the mega range. If each pixel if we consider just a black and white screen, each pixel needs 1 bit to either be on or off. That's a megabit every time we flash it. And while computers do have a lot of speed, right, we're usually up the most basic laptops nowadays are going to have several gigahertz at least, which means it can move a giga's 1 giga. I'll say gigabits. So a gigabit is a billion bits. It's power to giga means billion when we use it for like gigameters or gigagrams, other places in the metric system. Giga refers to billions, whereas mega is million. So if we're talking gigahertz and each hertz, so if we have a 2.2 gigahertz computer, that means we can move 2.2 billion bits every second. Hertz means per second. So 2.2 gigahertz, I'm referring to that because that's what my laptop has here. 2.2 gigahertz means we can move 2.2 billion bits per second. Obviously, computers have a lot going on. How many of those bits does the operating system need to work? How many things are running simultaneously on the computer, right? How many bits does the antivirus software need to run every time? So that speed is dedicated, right? So if we ran a line to every pixel just on and off, we would need a megabit just to flash the screen. And how many times are we going to do that a second? So that number can add up very quickly, as you can see. So we don't want to do that. But we can back it off a little by taking advantage of rows and columns, right? Maybe we want this pixel on. No, that's no problem. We'll say that pixel and that pixel. Well, that's no problem, because to get to those, we just set up a grid. I'm going to count from up here and just do, this is 1, row 1, column 1, first row, first column. I'll use the nominal numbers, first, second, third, instead of counting numbers when we do 3. So using nominal numbers, so our first row, first column. We can turn that pixel on just by combining those numbers. Same thing over here. We're in the first row, last column, 1, 2, 3, 4. We can turn those pixels on with those instructions. So that means we give row instructions to turn on row 1, and we turn on pixel 1 and pixel 4. Well, that works fine for one row. Maybe we want this pixel on our second row, which would be 2, 3. And now we kind of hit a problem. Because if we did just fed that in straight in, well, we're going to turn on row 1, and we're going to turn on row 2. Row 2, and we're going to turn on column 1, column 3, and column 4. Column 1, 3, 4. But if we did this, well, that's going to turn on more pixels than we want, right? Because we said column 3, so this pixel is going to be on. And we said pixels 1 and 4, so these two are going to be on. Which is not the pixels we wanted to turn on. So we deal with that to take care of that and get back to just the pixels we want. We use multiplexing. Which there's a lot of technicalities to get into multiplexing, but let's go look at a super simple example. Two rows, this is the example that I've set up on the circuit board over there. 2 rows, 4 columns. So if we can do it on 2, we can do it on 2 million. So it's just the same thing word B. So let's talk about multiplexing, at least a quick introduction to that. So here's our circuit set up for examples today. We don't need this part yet, that's for the second example. So for the first part, multiplexing, over here we'll use one of these, probably use one of the knobs to make it a little easier to visualize. So right now, just have the Uno supplying power over to these rails, and I have the negative side of the LEDs, both of these going through a resistor, because we have to have a resistor on an LED or it's going to blow quicker than it'll blow quicker than you can say "aw shucks" or something, some similar phrase. So each of these wires controls the row, and then these 4 wires plugging into on the positive side, each can control a column of this little 2x4 grid. So to start with, just mimicking what was on the board there. So if I turn on this top row, and looks like the brown wire here is the first LED, and the orange wire here will be our 4th LED. So with just one row, that's fine. We can just turn on the row and which ones we want. The second, but as soon as we turn on the second row here, oh, we can already see the problem. If you remember that picture, I only had, when I sketched the picture a moment ago, I only wanted the 3rd LED in the second row. So don't really need to plug it up, but if we do that, go ahead and do that, we can see that turns on the 3rd LED in the first row as well. So to fix this is multiplexing, which basically just means we're going to turn on rows one at a time. So we'll turn on just the LEDs we want on the first. So we'll turn on just the first row with the 2 LEDs we want there. Then we will turn off the first row and turn on the second row with just the LEDs we want on the second row. And then we're going to repeat. So I'm going to adjust this a little and put a speed, control the speed with one of these knobs here.
to make it a little easier to see how this is working. And be back in just a moment. So here is the code for our microcontroller today. Not going over to super detail. Basically, what I was just plugging up by hand in the last scene, I plugged those into pins on the microcontroller on the Uno board, and then gave each pin a more useful name to make the code a little easier to read. With just 2 rows and 4 columns, that's not too many to list out names for. And then one of the potentiometers that's hooked up is feeding into an analog input. Then for the setup, just set all of those row and column pins to outputs, and that potentiometer pin to an input. And here's the stripped down version of multiplexing. If it'll fit on the screen, maybe I should make this big. There we go, that way it'll fit on the screen. So the stripped down basic version is here. We set what pins we want to turn on for the first row, and the positive connection is controlling the columns, so those turn on when there's a high signal. But the rows are controlled by the negative connection, so those turn on when there's a low signal. So the positive end is we turn on with a high signal, and then the row is connected on the negative end, so that's what we call active low. So it turns on whenever we send a low signal, and row 2 turns off when we send a high signal. So 1 and 0 don't always mean on and off. It kind of depends on how we wire it. This is another good example of that. I believe everything we've done in class so far, we've always used a 1 for on and a 0 for off. But right here, our 0 is off, our 0 is on, and our 1 is off. And then we read whatever value the potentiometer is set to and wait for that many milliseconds. It's going to be something between 0 and 1024. So somewhere between 0 millisecond delay and just over a second delay. That way we can see what's going on with it. And then do the same thing for the second pin. So the columns are active high, so they turn on when we send a 1, and the rows are active low, so row 2 turns on when we send a 0. And then we delay again, and it repeats. So that's the basic, most stripped down version of multiplexing. So let's go over and look at this now. Okay, so here's the same thing hooked up, and we know something that works 1 row at a time. So that's kind of the essence of multiplexing. We know it'll work 1 row at a time, so we just do it 1 row at a time. So right now I have this little knob controlling the speed, set pretty low, but if I turn it up, we can flash, do the first row, then the second row. First row, second row, first, second, and keep turning this up. It gets faster and faster. And eventually we hit a spot where it looks like they're both on. Looks like everything's on. And that's what multiplexing is. We just go from row to row, do the first row, turn it off, do the second row, turn it off, in this case back to the first row, and kind of balance it out. So you've probably seen before where screens get out of phase with the camera. Obviously that's happening here as well, but we can still kind of tell it's flashing faster and faster and faster, and eventually it hits that spot where it's flashing so fast our eyes can no longer distinguish between them. And with the way video is just subsequent pictures, just picture after picture after picture, it can get a little out of phase with screens. You've probably seen that effect before. So it doesn't quite look right. And there's a subtle balance, right? If we go too far over here, we get some bleed over. And then it's going back and forth between them so quickly it looks like everything's on. So we don't want to go the fastest possible speed. We have to back it off until we find that nice little balance. So with the camera, we can still see a little bit of flash here. But I guess you'll just have to trust me that with my eyes, it looks like only these three are on, and I can't see the flash with those. If I back it off just a little, we kind of get there, get rid of that little bit of flash. No, the camera's still going to pick up a little bit of it. But that's kind of what multiplexing is. We just flip through our rows so quickly that, well, faster than the human brain distinguishes two things as separate events. So our brain just blends that flash and that flash together into one single event. And that's what multiplexing is. And it's kind of a balance. It's like I showed, if we go too fast, everything shows up and it just all blends together into one. So we have to find that just the right speed where it's fast enough to appear solid, but slow enough that we don't get any overlap between them and still separate row from row. So that's the idea of multiplexing. There's still a slight issue here that's not quite like our regular screens though. And I specifically chose green to state this sentence because at one time it would have been true. There was a time when our screen, the pixels on our computer screens were either green or off. I'm old enough to remember that. Most of the people in my class here, that was probably way before your time, way before you were born. But there was a time when our screens were either green or off. So kind of an old one. And so that concept obviously going to work fine with any of these LEDs, right? Whether we want a green LED, a blue, a red, a white one, clear one, just natural color. I think that's generally referred to as white. Often when I'm looking at it, the word clear pops out. Just the natural color that a diode emits. So a diode is a piece that controls the flow of the current. So the current can only flow one way through a diode. That's why they're different lengths, so we can tell which way it's going. And the process of doing so creates photons of light. So if we put a transparent or semi-opaque casing on the diode, then it's a light emitting diode. And so in essence, all diodes emit light. It just semi-transparent casing diode doesn't flow off the tongue very well. So when we have a clear case on the diode, that's when we have a light emitting diode. So have any color we choose, but we usually hear red, green, blue screens, right? RGB. And we don't use 3 LEDs for that. We don't bring in a red, green, and blue LED. We use one of these. This is an RGB LED. So you very quickly notice there's more pins. Instead of 2 pins, we have 4. And that's because that way we can control how much red, how much green, and how much blue is being emitted. And then those blend together to produce just the color we want. So let's go talk about colors real quick, and then we'll come back and see how we see that in an example of that.
So multiplexing took care of that problem really quick. Flash it quicker than human eyes can perceive, and we can get back to it appears like just the pixels we want on or off. And we don't have to have this many control lines. And it's electrical thing, so actually we need to run power to it and then back to ground. So there's that second issue, but let's just look at control lines. As we look at that, the LED instead of just the RGB LED, adding in some colors, we need 3 control lines instead of just 1 line for on and off. So there'd be 3 times that many to get colors in there. But with multiplexing, we can make it a whole lot more efficient. Typically, software has algorithms that check the screen size and figure out what's going to be most efficient. Glancing at these, we need to add 3 control wires to one of them. So 1366 by 768 on the laptop I'm making this on. One of them needs to be multiplied by 30. I'm thinking it's probably easier to multiply that by 30. And then we'll run 3 control wires here. So that's how many? 3 times 7 is 21. Times 6, 18. So 2 is 8. 3 times 8 is 24. 2304. I erased that with my hands a couple times, but 2,304 lines to get our RGMB, to get our color control. And then we can multiplex across the columns and run this many control wires. It's a whole lot less than even one control wire to each pixel on and off was going to be. So that's how multiplexing takes care of that problem. And now the next thing that was pointed out before we come over here is getting control over what color we're sending. And it's very related to multiplexing. In particular, the way that we flash through our rows or columns, whichever way we go, whichever way we multiplex it, we flash through quicker than the human eye can pick up, right? So our eye picks it up and our brain just fills in the gap and it looks like one single picture and we don't notice any of that. It's very related to that. So let's talk about that. First off, a quick note about color. So a quick note about color. If you're like the average person, you probably feel like you've heard some contradictory information about how we produce a color. And not really, it's just often not spelled out all the way in detail. Right? In elementary school art class, you were probably taught to mix red, yellow, and blue to get any color you want. Right? To be more precise, it's actually magenta, yellow, and cyan. And that's how, in an art class, we produce any color we want. Whereas in electronics class, I just wrote it up here a minute ago. We're mixing red, green, and blue. And, it almost might seem like contradictory information at first. It's like, oh, is there more than one way to mix things and get a color? Kind of, but the answer to that should be no. So let me draw some pictures here. It's based off, we have different ways to perceive things. So let's do this one first. So there's us. We want to see some colors, and I don't know, we're a tree. We're going to look at a tree, and we're going to see a tree with green leaves and brown, a brown trunk, something like that. And what we see is based off sunlight. So sunlight contains every color of light. So we have this light coming in, which is white light. Whenever we take every color and shine it at once, they blend together and produce white, as opposed to black being the absence of light. So that white light comes from the sun, and some of it is absorbed by the tree, and other bits of it come back and hit our eye. Got a really big eye on the stick man there. And what comes back and hits our eye is partial. I'll show you that. It's partially white light, because some colors were absorbed by the tree. And to be precise, green was absorbed by the leaves on the tree. So when the partial white light comes back and hits our eye, we see what's missing. So that's what we get from the art class mixtures. This is what we see with reflected light. Reflected white light. So when light hits something, some of the color spectrums are absorbed and others bounce back. We see what's missing, and we mix colors to get those by mixing magenta, yellow, and cyan. Opposed to that is like in the case here. Now we're a stick man, and I might as well draw a really big eye again, looking at something. And in this case, let's draw a light bulb. And in particular, green LED, like the example we were just looking at a minute ago. Here, we're not seeing the reflection of the light, we're seeing light from the source itself. So when we're mixing colors for light directly from the source, that's when it's a red, green, blue mixture. So there's two different ways that we can see light, right? It can be coming directly from the source, or it can be parts of the light reflecting off something. And we see the color that's missing with reflected light, whereas we see what is there from the source light. That's why we need different colors to mix together to get them. Okay, I held myself back from getting into any complicated physics there. So hopefully that was kind of answered questions you may have had about that, and I was able to avoid complicated math, complicated EM math. So let's look at that multicolor LED instead of just the single colored ones, which are quick and easy to hook up, for examples. Okay, so finally to this LED here. Our basic one, the ones we saw earlier for going over multiplexing, just 2 leads, so we can turn it on and off. But if we want to add colors, we have a couple more. There's going to be different lengths ones. Well, I'll start with the longest one. So the longest one is either a cathode or an anode. We cannot tell by looking. And actually, I'm going to go ahead and avoid those words. Those are chemistry terms, and I always feel like they're backwards with electrical stuff, knowing what they do in chemistry. And that confuses me whenever I talk about it. So the longest lead will either go to the positive or negative side. If it goes to the negative side, then these other 3 leads go to the positive side, and vice versa from what I just said. So this goes to the longest lead goes to the positive side, the other 3 go to the negative side. And they look identical, so we have to actually check to see whether we have an anode RGB LED or a cathode RGB LED. We have to actually check and see which one we have, which just hook it up, and if it doesn't work, flip the polarity, see if it works that way. They look identical. They're a small piece. There's not enough room for labels, and we intermingle them. That way, when we have a big grid, if say we have the positive voltage rail up here and the negative voltage rail up here, we can switch which one we're using so that we don't have to run wires all the way across. Our wires, we can use the one that makes the wiring cleanest and mix and match it to make the wiring cleanest. So you sometimes have to check with these, and the longest lead will either go to positive or negative, and the other ones are used to control the RGB values. So turn on some red, turn on some green, turn on some blue, and we control what light is actually showing by sending a different levels down each one of the R, G, and B pins. And hopefully that last little sentence there just set off some alarms in your mind. Right? Like, what do you mean levels? We're talking about computer control. We have a 1 and a 0. We don't have a level. We have off and we have on. We could, Yoda's famous quote here, right? We have do or do not. We can't try to send a 1 and end up with half of it on the signal. But there is a nice way we can fake it and make it seem like we have levels. And it's very related to the multiplexing that we just saw. We can just send those 1s and 0s, but we only have on or off, but we do have excellent control over the time that something is on or the time that something is off. So we can adjust that. So like a long on and a short off signal. So have something on for a long time, then off for a very short amount of time, on for a long time, off for a very short amount of time, on for a very long time, kind of repeating. But our average on time here is going to be way up here. Our average on is up near fully on. Or we could swap that and do a short on and a long off. So it's on for a very short amount of time and off for a long time. On for a very short amount of time, off for a long time. And kind of keep repeating that. And in this case, our average on is way down here. So, and obviously any point in between them. And then we do this so quick that human perception doesn't really pick up on it as separate things. When we perceive all these brief pulses, our brains process that signal into a low average on. Kind of process that average. That's basically the same thing that's happened with multiplexing. It's quicker than our senses distinguish two separate events, so our brain processes it into a single thing. So, like the similar LEDs, instead of just turning them on for a long time or off for a long time, we can send pulses down some pattern where we control how long those pulses are and how far apart they are, and make it look like it's almost on, like not quite all the way on, or just barely on, based off of that average on time. And this is called pulse width modulation. Or PWM. PWM is a whole lot easier to say. But pulse width modulation, and then we can take those average ons and create a whole bunch of different levels to control our red, green, and blue pins with. And we're talking about screens today, but really quick here, we can simulate analog signals with that as well. In the real world, we have nice smooth curves on things, every value in between the whole spectrum. But in the computer world, we only have discrete values. We can use PWM and use those average on time signals to kind of simulate the analog wave. So that it's still discrete values, and they arise from this. So it's lots and lots of rapid ons and offs that kind of average to almost off or almost on and everything in between. And when humans process that with our senses process and brain process through that, it's happening so quick, our brains go ahead and blend it into one single signal. So it simulates an analog signal. That's probably the more common use, excluding how everything has screens on it, obviously. That'd be a complicated calculation to figure out which one it is. But screens are already pre-made for us. We just plug those up. This is just going over how a screen works. This is what we do this in our code. We have to set this up in our code a lot. But this is the one we need for adding colors into that grid that we saw, a multiplex grid that we saw a minute ago to produce a screen. Pulse width modulation. So let's go over here and look at an example of that in a circuit.
And so here is the code for the microcontroller to run that RGB LED. So once again, I just gave the pins a useful name. It's a Uno, so we have real analog inputs, and I hooked a potentiometer up to each one. That way we have a knob to control how much red, green, or blue there is. And then we don't have PWM on every pin. About half the pins have PWM availability. So here's 3 of the pins that have we can do pulse width modulation on. And for that, what we do is we send a value somewhere between 0 and 255. And then all the PWM is handled internally to determine the right frequency for somewhere between 0 and 255 are the values we have for it. Then to set it up, just the potentiometers are inputs and those signal lines are outputs. And then most of the code then down in the loop, most of it happens right here. So what we're going to do is we're going to analog write, and an analog write is a PWM. So we're going to send PWM signal to the red pin. And that's a value somewhere between 0 and 255. So we get that value, but we're going to remap stuff. So we're going to read what's on the analog read. We're going to read what the potentiometer is set to, and that'll be a value somewhere between 0 and 124. So we're going to take this range, 0 to 124, and then we're going to remap it from 0 to 255, which is the range of values we have for our PWM. And then do that for the green and the blue as well. So that's what's going on in the code. So let's go see this working. And obviously the knobs are for the example purposes. Usually we'll know what colors we want, and then we can do it just like we would RGB values in any language. We just send in a number, a red somewhere between 0 and 255. Well, usually between 00 and FF. We use hex for the RGB values, but I just use the integers here. So let's go see this operating. Okay, and so here's our circuit demonstrating that. That's what I brought these knobs in for. We just looked at the code, so you can see that as I turn the knob, it varies between, the knob sends in a value between 0 and 1024, and then that gets remapped to a value somewhere between 0 and 255 to mix different values. So as we add different amounts of red, green, and blue, we can control what color it is. So there's a bunch of red by itself, or a bunch of green by itself, or over here a bunch of blue by itself. And then when we start mixing them, we get different colors. So the green and red together getting kind of yellow. It looks whitish on the video, but this is what should count as white. I guess that does leave that looking like
yellow. So yeah, so kind of a yellowish mix around a little bit more kind of purplish. I think there's an orange somewhere around here. Nope, that came out green. But you can see as we get different values, as we throw in different values, we get different colors from our RGB LED. Whoops. Using pulse width modulation to determine how much red, green, or blue is sent to the LED at any particular time.
So that's kind of the quick introduction level breakdown of how screen works. The multiplexing isn't run on the board anymore, and pulse width modulation so that we can get colors to those pixels. Right? The multiplexing to determine which pixel's on, and then pulse width modulation to determine what color that pixel is showing. It often makes me think of a concept from music. There's some other musicians you might be familiar with this, faking it. That's actually what musicians call it. It's like, somebody in the audience requests a song. It's like, well, I don't know it, but I know what key it's in, and I know about how fast that song, the tempo of that song is. So I'll go ahead and pretend like I know it. And one of the key points in faking it with music is if it starts to fall apart, then you just take it further and intentionally turn it into an artistic interpretation of the song. That way it doesn't completely go away, but make it through the song. And a lot of times the audience is, crowds are fine with that. So it's a common thing in music called faking it. And both of these kind of make me think of that from music. We can't turn all our pixels on at once. But with a computer, we can do it. We can turn a row of pixels, turn them on row by row really, 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 really quick. And the person looking at the screen will never know the difference. It's kind of like that. And same thing with this. The analog segment around here is probably better, right? If that was a sound wave, the person here, if the real one's a sound wave, the person hearing that pulse width modulation version of it isn't going to tell the difference because it happens so fast, it blends together and sounds just like it, right? You can listen to that really, right? Go back to the 70s and listen to digital sounds from the 70s compared to digital sounds from we're in the 2020s now. It's come a long ways, and the digital sounds sound like the real ones now because the PWM has gotten so good at simulating that, at faking that sound, just like the musicians do. So it often makes me think of that. And that's kind of a quick breakdown on how screens work. I hope that helped clear up some questions you may have had on it.